So in this second part of step 8, we're going to think a bit about the usefulness of the track function and in fact, how to use it. Most of the time, you might think it's very simple. You track by the ID of the object you're iterating over. But the reason behind it is a bit more subtle, and it's actually quite interesting to understand exactly what's happening under the hood. In fact, Angular will rely on what you tell it to track, on what you tell it about when it should recreate the object. So specifically in this example, I'm telling it to recreate the object when the amount property of currency changes. In this step 8.2, I really suggest you dive into it. You'll see that what's being done here is quite interesting. So we can open up the browser console and see what's happening. We notice that this log appears multiple times. If we check, this is the log in question. So that means every time the constructor of the balance card component is called, I simply display this log. What does that mean? It means that here continues well, because I have an interval that updates the amount for each of the balance cards. But regardless, it means that every time the tracked property in the for loop changes, the components are completely recreated, that is destroyed and then recreated. Now, if we comment out what's here and use this instead, we'll see that the difference is actually quite significant. Here, in just a few seconds, we had 144 refreshes. In fact, there was 1 refresh per second since we have a 1-second interval, whereas here, even though we still have the same interval, the values are still being updated. However, since we told Angular to track by the label and the label doesn't change, only the amount changes. At that point, it thinks, well, since the label hasn't changed, I don't need to recreate the components. That's why generally we like to track by ID, but it's not strictly necessary. We can track by something else. Most of the time, that's still what we use to track, but in some cases, we might need to recreate the component based on another variable of the object we're iterating over. It's something to be aware of and that we can use. That wraps up our step 8, which covered using the for loop with a slightly more interesting focus on using track, which is often overlooked and not very well known by most developers. So with this step 8, we're done with this for loop, and we can move on to step 9.